A woman was found half buried in the snow, her ribs shattered, her fingers black with frostbite, left to die by the one person who was supposed to protect her. The man who found her wasn't a hero. He was a ghost who'd chosen to disappear from the world, scarred, solitary, and dangerous in ways most men couldn't afford to be. He should have kept writing. He didn't. And that single decision, made in 30 seconds, in the middle of a dying blizzard, would cost them both everything before it gave them anything worth keeping. This is their story. If it moves you, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Every single part matters. The mule smelled the blood before Ridge Mercer did. He felt it through the reins first. A subtle shift in the animal's gait, a tightening in the neck muscles, the way her ears swiveled forward and locked like compass needles pointing at something wrong. Mules didn't spook the way horses did. They went still. They assessed. And right now, standing at the edge of the old Hatcher relay station clearing, the mule had gone absolutely motionless in a way that made the hair on the back of Ridge's neck stand up beneath his collar. He pulled up and sat for a moment, not moving, not speaking, just watching. The relay station was a wreck, not the ordinary kind of wreck that came from years of abandonment and bad weather. He'd seen plenty of those, buildings that simply gave up and fell in on themselves quietly, like old men sitting down to rest. This was different. The front door hung at a broken angle from a single hinge. One of the shutters had been torn completely off and lay face down in the snow 10 feet from the window frame. A wooden trunk, the kind a woman packed her whole life into for a long journey, had been dragged from the porch and smashed open in the yard. Its contents were scattered across the ground in a wide arc. A dress, dark blue and stiff with cold. Papers. A hairbrush with the handle broken off. A small tin box pried open and emptied. And the snow. The snow around all of it was not white. Ridge stepped down from the mule slowly, kept hold of the reins, and stood for a long moment just reading the yard the way 10 years in the Montana wilderness had taught him to read things. Tracks in the snow. Multiple sets, boots, heavy men, at least 3 of them, maybe 4. The tracks came from the east, from the direction of the main road, and they did not leave the same way they arrived. They left heading north into the tree line, and they were not walking when they made that exit. The stride pattern was long and hurried, running or close to it, and then there were the drag marks. 2 parallel lines in the snow, close together, shallow, not heavy cargo. Something lighter, something that had been dragged on its back, or close enough to it, from the porch steps toward the northern tree line where the other tracks had gone. Ridge stood there looking at those marks for a full 10 seconds. His jaw worked side to side the way it did when he was thinking through something he didn't want to think through. He'd ridden 4 hours in worsening weather to get here. The sky above the peaks had been threatening since mid-morning, that particular gray-green color that old mountain men learned to fear, and young ones sometimes didn't live long enough to learn. He had a cabin stocked with wood, food laid in for 2 weeks, and enough sense to know that whatever had happened here was not his business, not his problem, and not his responsibility. He tied the mule to the porch post anyway, and followed the drag marks into the trees. The cold under the pines was a different animal than the cold in the open. Out in the yard, the wind at least moved, carried some illusion of the world still functioning. Under the old growth timber, the air was dead still, and the silence was the kind that pressed against your ears like water. His boots punched through the crust of old snow with each step. He moved carefully, not because he was afraid. Ridge Mercer had made his peace with fear a long time ago, but because speed wasn't what this required. Attention was. He almost missed her. She was underneath a fallen pine, one of the old ones that had uprooted in the autumn storms and come down at an angle against 2 smaller trees, creating a kind of low cave of tangled branches and dead needles. The drag marks ended here. Whoever had been dragging her had shoved her underneath that fallen tree and left her. He crouched down and pushed a heavy branch aside. She was alive. He could tell because her chest was moving, barely, in irregular shallow hitches that didn't look like breathing so much as her body forgetting what it was supposed to do and then remembering at the last second. She was lying on her side, knees pulled up toward her chest, arms wrapped around herself in the posture of someone who had stopped trying to get warm and started simply trying to hold themselves together. Her coat was gone. She was in a dress and a thin wool shawl that had done approximately nothing against the temperature. Her hair, dark, long, partially come loose from whatever pins had been holding it, was matted with blood on the left side of her head. Her lips were the color of a bruise. Her eyes were closed. Ridge leaned in closer. "Hey." Nothing. "Hey." Louder this time, not gentle, more like he would speak to the mule when she was being stubborn about a river crossing. "Open your eyes." One eye opened, just barely. The iris was dark brown, unfocused, swimming. It tried to find him, and couldn't quite manage it. "There you are," he said. Not warmly, just acknowledging the fact. Her mouth moved. He couldn't hear it. He leaned closer. Cold. The word was barely air. "Yeah." He sat back on his heels and looked at her for a moment. He was calculating things. The distance back to the cabin, the state of the sky, the state of her. None of the numbers were good. Her feet, what he could see of them through torn stockings, had that waxy yellow look that meant frostbite was already working on her. The blood on the side of her head had frozen in a dark rivulet along her jaw. Her shawl, when he touched it, was stiff with ice. He stood up and looked back through the trees toward the clearing where the mule waited. He looked up at the sky through the gaps in the branches. The green-gray had deepened. He had maybe 2 hours before this turned into something a man couldn't see his hand in front of his face through. He looked back down at the woman under the pine. "Can you walk?" The eye that had been open was closed again. "Right," he said. He went back for the mule. Getting her up and onto the mule was not graceful. Nothing about the next 10 minutes was graceful. She was dead weight and dead cold, her limbs uncooperative, her body refusing to bend the way it needed to. And when he tried to lift her, she made a sound. Not a scream, something worse than a scream. A low, involuntary animal sound that told him somewhere beneath the shock and the cold she was badly hurt in ways he couldn't see yet. He froze when she made that sound. Held still. Let her breathe. "I'm going to pick you up," he said. Not asking. Informing. He'd found that was better with injured things. Animals, people, didn't matter. Tell them what was happening. Don't pretend it isn't going to hurt. He slid one arm under her knees and one arm behind her back and lifted. She made that sound again, and her head fell against his chest and her fist closed around a fistful of his coat front like she was holding on to the only solid thing in the world. He stood with her for a second, not moving, letting the pain pass through her if it was going to. "I've got you," he said, which surprised him because he hadn't planned to say it. He got her up on the mule belly down first, which he hated doing but couldn't help. She couldn't sit up, couldn't hold herself. He rigged a rough harness with his rope to keep her from sliding off, then wrapped his own coat around her over the top of her useless shawl. He was left in his shirt and vest, and the cold hit him like a wall, but he didn't let himself think about it. He took the mule's reins and started walking. The snow started 20 minutes later. Ridge knew the trail back to his cabin the way he knew the inside of his own hands. Every turn, every dip, every place where the ground went soft in the thaw and dangerous in the freeze. He knew it in daylight. He knew it in the dark. What he didn't know it in was a full Montana whiteout, which was what arrived in stages over the next 40 minutes, until the world reduced itself to about 4 feet of visible ground in every direction, and a noise like the mountain itself was trying to shake something loose. The mule, to her credit, kept moving. He talked to her. He talked to the mule, and then, almost without deciding to, he talked to the woman draped across her back. Not about anything, just words, steady and continuous, because he'd found that with anything suffering and frightened, sound mattered more than content. The sound of a voice meant something living was nearby. It meant not alone. "Stay awake," he said. "I need you to stay awake. I know it's cold. I know it hurts. Stay awake anyway." I didn't know if she could hear him. He kept saying it. The trail climbed steeply for the last half mile, and that was where it nearly ended. The mule put a front hoof wrong on a section of trail that had iced over beneath the new snow, and went down on her knees with a lurch that sent the woman sliding sideways against the rope harness. Ridge caught the mule's head before she could panic, planted himself against the slope, and spent the better part of 5 minutes talking the animal back up onto 4 legs, while simultaneously keeping the woman from sliding off into the dark. His hands by this point had gone from painful to something past painful. The kind of cold where you couldn't feel your fingers, but you could still use them if you told them to work. And you didn't think too hard about what they felt like. "Almost there," he said to both of them. "Almost there." He didn't actually know if that was true. It was. Barely. The cabin materialized out of the white dark like something imagined and then real. The dark bulk of the walls, the deeper black of the window. He'd never been so glad to see that ugly, cramped, low-ceilinged box in his life. He got the door open, got her inside, laid her on the floor by the stone fireplace because the floor was closer than the cot, and he needed heat on her now, not in 2 more minutes. He built the fire with hands that didn't want to cooperate, struck the flint 4 times before it caught, fed it paper and dry bark, and then the good split oak he kept stacked beside the hearth. He got the mule into the lean-to stable, gave her water and feed, because the mule had earned it, and also because you didn't let the animal that just saved your life stand cold and hungry in a blizzard. When he came back inside, the woman had moved. She'd dragged herself 2 inches closer to the fire and was lying with her face almost against the stones of the hearth, like she was trying to absorb the heat directly through her skin. "Not too close," he said, crossing quickly and pulling her back a foot. "If your feet are frostbit, you can't feel how hot it is. You'll burn yourself without knowing it." She didn't respond. She was somewhere between conscious and not. He'd seen it before, that gray middle ground where the body was still running, but the mind had stepped outside for a moment to wait out the worst of it. He pulled off her frozen shoes, which was difficult and clearly painful, and she made sounds but didn't wake fully. Her feet were bad. The toes were that waxy yellow white, and the skin had the hard texture of something that wasn't behaving like skin anymore. Not the worst frostbite he'd seen, but bad enough to require attention. He wasn't sure he knew how to give properly. I did what he knew. He got the willow bark from the shelf, got the tin pot of water heating at the edge of the fire, got the threadbare extra blanket from the chest and laid it over her. Looked at the wound on the side of her head. Not as bad as it had looked in the woods. Head wounds bled dramatically for their actual severity, but it needed cleaning. He heated water, tore strips from an old shirt he kept for rags, and cleaned the wound with the care of a man who had no one to ask for help if he did it wrong. She had bruising on the left side of her face, not the accidental bruising of a fall, the patterned, deliberate bruising of a fist. Somebody's knuckles laid into her cheekbone and jaw with intent. It made something move through Ridge's chest that he recognized as anger, but didn't have time for right now. He worked through the early evening and into the night. When she started burning, it was almost a relief, because burning meant she wasn't dying cold and quiet, which was the kind of dying that didn't announce itself. The fever came up fast, the way it did when a body had been fighting something off as long as it could and finally ran out of reserves. She was shaking within an hour of warming up, the violent bone-deep shaking that was actually a good sign physiologically and a brutal thing to watch. She was talking in it, or trying to, fragments, words that didn't connect to each other, a name repeated 3 or 4 times that Ridge caught and filed away without reacting to. Silas. She said it like a curse and like a plea, both at once. She said it the way you said the name of something that had already hurt you so badly you couldn't stop touching the bruise. Ridge sat on the floor beside her cot. He'd moved her to the cot by then, which had taken effort, and listened and kept the fire built and refilled the tin cup with willow bark tea every time it ran low, tipping it carefully between her lips when she was still enough to swallow without choking. I was not a man who did bedside vigils. He was not, in any version of himself he recognized, a caretaker. He'd spent 10 years alone on this mountain by choice, not circumstance, by the deliberate, considered decision that other people were more trouble than they were worth, and that the wilderness asked only what it asked, no more, and didn't lie about what it needed from you. He sat there all night. The photograph had arrived in September. He'd placed the advertisement in the spring, 3 months after a hard winter that had nearly killed him, not from cold or accident, but from the sheer weight of the silence, which he hadn't admitted to himself at the time, and could barely admit now. The frontier papers ran columns for it, men seeking women willing to come west. It had felt, writing the advertisement, like one of the most humiliating things he'd ever done. He was 34 years old, 6'2", with a face that looked like it had been used for something rough. A scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his jaw, courtesy of a trapper's knife fight 7 years back, and the kind of build that made strangers cross to the other side of whatever street they were on. He'd written the advertisement in 3 drafts and thrown away 2 of them and sent the 3rd before he could change his mind. Eliza Vane had answered. Her letter had been careful and direct in a way that surprised him. No flowery language, no promises she couldn't know if she could keep. She had written, I am 26 years old, in good health, and accustomed to work. I have no illusions about frontier life and would not insult you by pretending otherwise. I am looking for a place to belong. If that sounds like something you need to offer, I would like to hear more." He'd read that letter 4 times. Then he'd written back. They had corresponded for 6 months. He kept her letters in the box under the floorboard with his money and his land deed, the only things he considered worth protecting. He didn't reread them often. He didn't need to. He remembered them. She was supposed to arrive at the Hatcher relay station on a specific date in November, coming in on the stage from Billings. He'd planned the whole thing, arranged with the station keeper to give her shelter if he was delayed, packed supplies for 2 riders on the return trip, allowed himself, in small and carefully managed ways, to consider what it might be like to have another person in the cabin when the snow came down. Now she was in his cot, burning with fever, and someone had beaten her half to death and taken everything she carried and left her to freeze under a fallen tree. He looked at her face in the firelight, swollen on one side, skin chapped and raw from the cold, lips cracked and peeling. The photograph she'd sent had shown a composed, dark-eyed woman with her hair up and her chin level in a way that suggested she was used to holding it that way. He could see that woman under the damage somewhere, the bone structure, the set of the jaw. "I am looking for a place to belong." Ridge put another log on the fire and settled back against the wall and watched her breathe. The fever broke on the 3rd day. He knew it was coming down because he'd been tracking it for 72 hours, the temperature of her forehead, when he changed the cool cloth, the sound of her breathing, the quality of the sounds she made when she moved. When it broke hard. She went from feverish and restless to soaking wet with sweat inside of an hour, the blanket plastered to her, her face going from red and dry to pale and clammy. He changed the blanket, changed the compress, gave her water, small amounts, frequently, because a person coming down from a fever that high needed to drink, or they'd slide right into something else. She woke up the following morning. He was at the table eating cold cornbread when he heard the sound of movement from the cot. Real movement, deliberate movement, not the random shifting of fever. He looked over. She was trying to sit up. "Don't," he said. She stopped, looked at him. Her eyes were clear. Not fully focused, not fully sharp, but present, which was different from anything he'd seen in them for 3 days. She looked at him with the careful assessment of someone waking up in an unfamiliar place and taking stock before deciding how to react to it. He watched her take in the room, the low ceiling, the rough log walls, the fireplace, the single window with its oiled hide cover, the shelves with their rows of canned goods and dried stores, the rifle above the door. Then she looked at him again. It was wearing a flannel shirt and wool trousers. He hadn't shaved in 4 days, and he was aware that he looked, by any reasonable measure, like something the mountain had assembled from available materials rather than anything a woman would choose to wake up next to under normal circumstances. "Ridge Mercer," he said. "You answered my advertisement." She blinked. Her voice, when it came, was rough and barely there. "I know who you are." "Good." He pushed the cornbread toward the edge of the table, a gesture, not a command. "Can you eat?" She looked at the cornbread. She looked like she might cry for a second, which he pretended not to notice. "I think so," she said. He got up, broke off a piece smaller than he'd been eating himself, poured water into the tin cup, brought both to the cot and crouched down to her level because she clearly couldn't come to him yet. She took the cornbread with a hand that shook. She ate it in small, careful bites, eyes down, jaw working slowly. He watched without commenting. When she was done, she drank the water. Then she held the empty cup in both hands and stared at the fire. "How long?" she asked. 3 days since I found you. 4 since whatever happened, I'd guess. She nodded, just barely. "Your feet got frostbite," he said. "The toes on your right foot are the worst of it. You'll keep them if you don't walk on them yet. Your ribs are bruised bad. I can wrap them if you're willing. It'll help. Your collarbone—" He paused because this one was harder. "Your collarbone is broken. Left side. I've said it as well as I know how. You'll need to keep that arm still." She was listening to all of this with her eyes on the fire and her face very still. "Your head wound is closed," he continued. "Didn't need stitching in the end. The bruising on your face—" He stopped. "I know about the bruising on my face," she said. "Right." He stood up, went back to his side of the table. Silence stretched between them, but it was a different kind of silence than the one he lived in normally. This one had something in it, weight, awareness. Thank you, she said, still looking at the fire, for coming in after me. You were bleeding in the snow. Some men would have kept riding. Ridge thought about that. Some men, he agreed. She slept most of the fourth day. Real sleep, not fever sleep, deep and long and still, her breathing regular, her body finally doing the basic work of repair that it had been too busy surviving to do before. He worked around her, brought in wood, cooked, did the 100 small chores that a mountain cabin in winter required. He moved quietly, not because he was trying to be considerate, or not only because of that, but because he had been alone for so long that quiet was his natural register. On the fifth day she was awake more than she was asleep. She watched him work. He was aware of it, that steady dark-eyed attention, but he didn't comment on it. He'd been watched before, usually by people trying to figure out how dangerous he was. Her watching didn't feel like that. It felt more like someone trying to solve a problem that they didn't have all the pieces to yet. The snow's not stopping, she said in the afternoon. She had worked herself up to sitting against the wall at the head of the cot, the blanket around her shoulders. It had taken her 10 minutes to manage it, and she'd done it without asking for help, which he respected. He glanced at the hide-covered window. No. How long can it go? Could stop tonight, could go 3 more weeks. He said it simply, without apology. That's the mountain. She received this without visible distress. Your supplies? Enough for 2. I planned for 2. She looked at him. You planned for me to be here. I planned for a person to be here, he said. Not specifically you in this condition, but he gestured vaguely at the shelves. Enough. She was quiet for a moment. The men who did this to me, she said carefully. Do you know who they were? One name, he said. You said it in the fever. Silas. Something crossed her face. Not surprise. Something older and more complicated than surprise. My brother, she said. Ridge set down the knife he'd been working with, slow, deliberate. He turned to look at her fully. Your brother, he repeated. Half-brother. She said it like the distinction mattered, though not enough to change the essential fact. His name is Silas Vane. He's 3 years older than me, and he has been in debt to dangerous men since before I can remember. She paused. I was carrying money. Everything I had. The stage fare, the relocation money I'd saved for 2 years, and some additional funds I'd received from... She stopped. From settling our father's estate. Silas knew about it. He must have followed the stage. How much? She met his eyes. Enough that it was worth leaving me under a tree to die for. Ridge held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to what he was doing. His jaw was working. I can find him, he said. His voice had gone flat in a specific way. Not emotionless, but too controlled. The way a man spoke when he was managing something he didn't want to let out in the wrong direction. I know this region. I know where men like that hole up in the winter. I know you can, she said. But? She looked at him with those clear, steady eyes. But I need you to wait. That night, the blizzard found its full voice. The wind came down off the upper ridges and hit the cabin like it was trying to push it off the mountain entirely. The walls flexed. He'd built them solid, notched and chinked, but nothing was solid enough to be truly indifferent to what the Montana high country could produce in November. Snow drove against the window hide in long, sustained hisses. The fire was the only certain thing in the room. Ridge sat in his chair, and Eliza sat in the cot with her back against the wall, and they listened to the storm work itself into fury around them. He'd offered her the chair. She'd declined, said the cot was fine, said the cot was better for her ribs, which was probably true. Why do you live up here? She asked. Not accusatory, genuinely curious. He thought about how to answer that. He'd had this conversation before, in town, with people whose version of the question always had a judgment threaded through it. What's wrong with you? Why don't you want to be around people? Are you running from something? Her version of it didn't have that quality. It was the question as it actually was, stripped of implication. I was good at it, he said finally. Surviving up here. It turned out I was better at it than at most other things. What other things? Being around people. He said it plainly, without shame and without self-pity. I don't do it well. He paused, searching for the right word. I don't understand how to be around people without something going wrong. She considered this. What goes wrong? Things get broken. He was quiet for a moment. Usually not things. Sometimes things. She didn't push that. He appreciated it. My father used to say I was more mountain than man, he said. He hadn't said that out loud before. The words felt strange in his mouth. He meant it as criticism. I took it as description. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind hit the cabin wall like a fist. I read your letters, she said quietly. All of them. More than once. He didn't respond to that. You're not more mountain than man, she said. You're a man who decided the mountain was safer. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. I understand that. Ridge looked at the fire. The log at the bottom had burned through and collapsed into a pile of red-hot coals that threw a steady, honest heat. Tell me about Silas, he said. And she did. She talked for a long time. He listened the way he listened to the mountain, fully, without interrupting, without offering his own experience as a counterweight to hers. He'd learned a long time ago that the most important thing you could do for a person telling you something hard was simply to not fill the space they were using to tell it. Silas Vane, it emerged, was not simply a man who had made bad choices. He was a man who had been making the same choice over and over for 20 years. The choice to take rather than earn, to threaten rather than persuade, to move on when the consequences caught up with him rather than standing still and accounting for them. Their father had enabled it for years, cleared the debts, smoothed the trouble, until he couldn't anymore, and then died before the full weight of what he'd enabled had come due. After the father died, Silas had turned to Eliza. Not at first, she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something that had the quality of old damage. At first he was fine, reasonable even. He helped settle the estate. I thought... She stopped. I thought he was trying. What changed? His debts, she said. They caught up to him. Men came looking for him in Chicago, and suddenly reasonable Silas turned back into the other one, and the other one needed money, and I was the only one left. She looked at her hands in the firelight. I gave him some of it. The first time I gave him some because he was my brother, and I thought that would be enough to buy peace. It wasn't. It was never enough. Every time I gave him something, it just confirmed to him that I would give him things. So you left. I answered your advertisement, she said. Yes. She said it with a dry quietness that was almost humor and not quite. He found himself almost smiling. He followed you. He must have had someone watching me, a neighbor maybe, or someone at the stage office. He knew the route. She was quiet for a moment. He didn't expect me to survive being left out in the cold. Ridge stood up, walked to the window and back, sat back down. He wasn't good at sitting still when he was angry, and he was very angry right now. Not the hot, immediate anger of a fight, but the slower, colder kind that settled in under your ribs and stayed there. I'll find him in the spring, he said, when the pass is open. She looked at him. I told you I need you to wait. I heard you. He met her eyes. I'm waiting until spring. That's not waiting forever. She studied him for a long moment. The fire cracked and shifted. Wind drove against the walls. All right, she said finally. All right, he agreed. By the end of the first week, she was arguing with him. Not badly, not viciously. But she had opinions about how he organized the dry stores, which she delivered with the directness of someone who had been holding herself together alone for long enough that she'd stopped softening her edges around other people. And he had opinions about how she was trying to use her left arm before her collarbone was ready, which he delivered in much the same way. And the two of them had 3 separate sharp exchanges in as many days that all ended the same way, with both of them going quiet, going back to what they'd been doing, and gradually, over the following hour, arriving back at some workable equilibrium. He found he didn't mind it. That was the part that surprised him. The friction itself, the small daily friction of another person in his space, another person's habits and opinions and presence. He'd been afraid of it. In the abstract way, he'd been afraid of this whole enterprise, as something that would feel invasive and wearing. It didn't. It felt more like the cabin itself felt in a hard wind, something tested, something that creaked and flexed but held. On the 9th day, she asked him to teach her to rap and set snares. He looked at her, still moving carefully, left arm in the sling he'd fashioned, limping slightly on the foot that was healing, and considered whether to tell her it was too soon. Inside traps first, he said, then outside when your foot's better. Inside traps? He showed her. He had a system of small cage-style traps he kept in the lean-to for catching the rabbits that came in under the stable wall after feed grain. He walked her through the trigger mechanism, the placement, the reset. She was a quick study. She didn't ask him to repeat himself. She watched once and then did it herself. And she only got it wrong once, which was about how wrong he got things the first time too, when someone was showing him something new. "You're going to want to put it further back from the wall," he said, watching her position one of the cage traps. "They run along the base. If it's sitting out in the middle, they'll go around it." She moved it, looked up at him. "Like that?" "Little more." He crouched beside her and shifted it another inch. His shoulder was about 6 inches from hers. He was aware of that in a way he'd been trying not to be for several days. "There." She looked at the trap for a moment and then looked at him. The lean-to was small, and the lantern he'd brought threw a warm, unsteady light, and she was very close, and he made himself stand up and take a step back and put his attention somewhere else. "Good," he said, heading for the door. "Check them in the morning." She caught a rabbit the next morning and was unreasonably pleased about it. He didn't say it was unreasonable. He let her be pleased about it because the rabbit had in fact been caught cleanly and correctly, and she'd done it right. And because, if he was honest with himself, which he was trying to be, this new and uncomfortable project, her being pleased about something felt good in a way that was its own kind of dangerous. He put more wood on the fire and didn't think about it. The storm cycled. A week of violence, 2 days of breathless cold and blue sky, another week of snow. The mountain managed its own schedule, and they managed their lives around it. He split wood, and she learned to stack it. He trapped, and she learned to skin. She taught him things too. She'd learned to read at a school in Chicago, and she read well, aloud and with expression. And in the evenings she sometimes read from the one book he owned, a battered guide to frontier botany that he'd had for years and never gotten past the 3rd chapter of. In her hands, the thing became interesting in a way it had never been when he was trying to read it himself. He also found out she could cook in ways that made his cooking look like what it was, which was basic fuel preparation. She couldn't do it yet. Not with the collarbone, not standing over a fire for long periods. But she directed him, from the cot, with a specificity that was sometimes maddening and sometimes produced results that surprised him. The first time he followed her instructions exactly on a venison stew, and it came out tasting like something an actual person would choose to eat, rather than something a man who'd stopped caring about food would eat. He sat and looked at his bowl for a moment. "You just made a face," she said from the cot. "I didn't make a face." "You made a face." "It's good," he said, which was not a face. It was an expression of acknowledgement. "It's very good." She looked at him with something in her expression that was close to a smile, though she hadn't fully smiled at anything yet. He thought she probably would, eventually. He thought it would change the whole face. He thought about that for a moment, then stopped. It was on the 11th night that she woke screaming. He was already awake. He didn't sleep well, hadn't for years, slept in short stretches, and woke often for no reason, and lay in the dark listening to the sounds of the mountain for a while before sleeping again. So when she came awake with a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a name, he was sitting up before he'd consciously decided to. She was sitting up in the cot, breathing hard, both hands flat against the blanket, looking at the far wall with her eyes wide and her face white. He waited. He didn't cross the room immediately. He'd found, in those first fever nights, that rushing toward someone caught in fear sometimes made it worse. The movement read as threat before the mind caught up with the context. After a moment she put her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she said, muffled by her palms. "Don't be. I woke you. I was awake." She lowered her hands, looked at him across the cabin. He was sitting on the floor, back against the wall, which was where he'd been before she woke. She looked at him with those dark, clear eyes for a long moment. "He was there," she said. "In the dream. He was—" She stopped. "It was just a dream." "I know." He got up, went to the fire which had banked down to coals, put a log on. The light came back up slowly, warm and orange, filling the room. When he turned around, she was watching the fire. "I'm not afraid of him," she said. It was the voice of someone saying something that was true, and also not entirely true. And who knew the difference? "I know what he is. I know how he thinks. That's supposed to make it better." "Sometimes it does," Ridge said. "Sometimes knowing what something is just means you know exactly what you're afraid of." She looked at him. "Is that how it is with you?" He sat back down against the wall. "Yes." She was quiet for a while, then, What are you afraid of? He looked at the fire. The log he'd put on was catching now, the bark curling and blackening at the edges before the wood beneath it came alive with light. Right now, he said. Right now. He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things. That I'm going to get this wrong, he said. That I'm going to... He stopped, started again. I've been alone a long time. I don't always know how to be careful with people. I break things I don't mean to. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. You carried me 4 miles through a blizzard, she said quietly, with frostbite in your own hands. He looked at his hands. He hadn't mentioned that. He didn't know she'd noticed. You stayed up for 3 days, she said. You wrapped my ribs and set my collarbone and made willow bark medicine every 4 hours. You talked to me when I was too sick to hear you. She paused. Ridge. He looked up. You're not as bad at this as you think you are. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. Ridge sat with his back against the wall of his cabin and felt something in his chest that he didn't have a good word for, something that had the quality of pain, and also something else entirely. Get some sleep, he said. She lay back down, pulled the blanket up. In a few minutes, her breathing evened out. Ridge sat by the fire until the gray pre-dawn light began to show around the edges of the window hide. He sat and he thought about things he hadn't let himself think about in a long time, and he didn't try to stop himself. And the mountain did what it always did. It kept going, indifferent and absolute and present, the only witness to the small and enormous thing that was quietly beginning in the one lit room on its flank. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Ridge hadn't anticipated and didn't quite know what to do with. He'd expected the presence of another person to feel like an intrusion, something he had to manage, work around, tolerate. He'd spent a decade calibrating his life to solitude, and solitude had specific textures, the way silence settled into a room and stayed there, the way you stopped noticing the sounds you made because there was no one to notice them for. He'd expected Eliza to disrupt all of that in ways that would confirm what he'd always believed about himself and other people. What he didn't expect was that he would start waking up in the mornings and listening for the sound of her moving around on the cot before he got up. Not because it worried him, though in the first week it had, but simply because the sound of her was there and his ear had apparently decided, without consulting him, that it was something worth orienting toward. She was a light sleeper. He discovered this on the 12th day when he got up before dawn to check on the fire, and she was already awake, sitting up with the blanket around her shoulders, looking at the window like she was trying to see through the oiled hide to whatever was happening on the other side. You don't have to get up, he said. I wasn't sleeping. You should be. My ribs hurt when I lie still too long. She said it plainly, without complaint, just information. It's better to sit up. He looked at her for a moment, then went and built the fire up properly. When he turned around, she was watching him with that steady, problem-solving attention. He'd gotten more accustomed to it. He still wasn't entirely comfortable with it, but he'd stopped reflexively looking away. Does it help? He asked. Sitting up? Some. She adjusted the sling on her left arm with her right hand, the small, careful movement of someone who'd made the same adjustment 100 times and was still trying to find the position that didn't ache. I'll be fine. I didn't ask if you'd be fine. I asked if sitting helps. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, a small recalibration, like she was noting a distinction she hadn't expected him to make. Yes, she said. It helps. He brought her the tin cup of water without being asked. Outside, the blizzard that had been threatening since yesterday finally arrived. They could both feel it before they heard it, a change in pressure, the way the cabin seemed to hold its breath for a moment, and then the wind came down off the ridge and hit the north wall like it had a specific grievance with the building. Ridge checked the door bar, checked the lean-to latch from the inside connecting door, and stood for a moment listening to the storm establish itself. Third major one this month, he said. Is that normal? For November, yes. December's worse. He came back to the table and sat down. We're not going anywhere for a while. Eliza looked at her hands. She'd been doing that more often lately. Looking at her hands in the firelight with the expression of someone taking inventory. He wondered what she was counting. Tell me what there is to do, she said. While we're stuck. I can't just sit on that cot for another 2 weeks. Your collarbone is healing, I know. I'm not asking to go split logs. She looked up at him. I'm asking what I can do with one arm that isn't useless. He thought about it honestly. There was work that could be done seated, with one functional arm. Mending. He had a pile of gear that needed stitching, harness straps and coat seams, and a blanket that had been threatening to come apart at one corner for a month. Sorting the dry stores. Reloading the spent cartridges he had in a box under the table, which required patience and fine motor work more than strength. She was watching him think. Harness repair, he said. If you're willing, show me. He showed her. He pulled the tack box out from the lean-to and spread the worst of it on the table and talked her through the stitching pattern he used on leather. The saddle stitch, 2 needles, the way you pulled each stitch tight before you started the next one so the seam would hold under real pressure. Her right hand was steady, and her stitches were neater than his almost immediately, which he noted without saying anything. You've done this before, he said. My father had horses. She drew the wax thread through the leather and pulled it even. I used to watch the stableman. He let me try sometimes. A pause. That was a long time ago. Chicago doesn't have a lot of use for tack stitching. No. She set the strap down for a moment, flexed her right hand, picked it back up. Chicago doesn't have a lot of use for most of what I actually know how to do. Ridge watched her work. What does Chicago have use for? Knowing which social calls to make and when. Being agreeable at dinner. Finding ways to make Silas's debts seem like accounting errors when the landlord came to the door. She said it without bitterness, which somehow made it worse. Just the flat recitation of a life that had asked her to be useful in ways that cost her. I can also play piano, she added, with the dry, almost humor he'd started to recognize, though I don't imagine that comes up much out here. No piano, he confirmed. Tragedy, she said, and drew the thread through again. He almost laughed. He stopped himself, but not quite quickly enough, and she caught it, the slight movement at the corner of his mouth, and her expression shifted in response, something warming in it, not quite the smile he'd been waiting for, but closer than anything he'd seen yet. He looked back down at the harness he was pretending to inspect. The storm hammered at the walls. The fire held. They worked in a silence that had stopped being uncomfortable somewhere in the last week, and had become something else. Shared, specific, the silence of 2 people in the same room who had run out of the need to fill space and hadn't yet run out of things to say, which was a different and better problem to have. It was late in the afternoon when Eliza said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." The scar. She didn't gesture toward it. She was too careful for that. But he knew which one she meant. There was only one that anyone ever meant. What happened? He was quiet for a moment, not because he hadn't expected the question. It always came eventually. Trapper named Aldous Webb, he said, 7 years ago. We had a disagreement about a line of traps he'd set inside my territory. Your territory. Land I'd staked and registered. He knew it was mine. He turned the cartridge he'd been reloading in his fingers. He pulled a knife, and I was slow to see it coming. That's what happens when you're slow. You killed him. It wasn't a question. He looked at her to see what was in her face when she said it. Judgment, fear, reassessment. What he found was something more complicated and more honest than any of those things. Curiosity and a kind of careful courage, the face of someone who wanted the real answer and had decided to ask for it. Yes, he said. She held his gaze, nodded once, went back to her stitching. That was all. He sat with that for a moment, the absence of a reaction that required him to defend himself or explain further, and found it unexpectedly settling. Silas has a knife, she said after a while, still looking at the leather in her hands. He's always had one. He likes people to see it. A pause. He pulled it on our father once. After the debts got bad, father backed down. She made another stitch. That was when I understood what Silas actually was. What is he? She looked up. Her eyes in the firelight were steady and dark and very serious. A man who's only ever won by making people afraid of him, she said. When someone stops being afraid, he doesn't know what to do. Ridge thought about that. You're not afraid of him. I am, she said simply. I just decided it doesn't get to make my choices for me anymore. She looked back down. That's not the same thing as not being afraid. The log in the fire collapsed with a sound like a hand slapping wood, and sparks rose and fell, and outside the mountain did what mountains do in November in Montana, which is whatever they feel like doing regardless of what anyone in the cabins below them wants. 3 more days passed in the same rhythm. Work, fire, food, sleep, The short, fierce arguments that had become their way of feeling out where the other person's edges were. On the 15th day he woke to find her standing at the window, which meant she'd walked there on her own, which meant her foot was better than she'd been letting on, or she'd been testing it quietly without telling him. "How long has the foot been better?" he said from his blanket. "2 days," she said, without turning around. She had one finger lifted the edge of the window hide, looking out at the frozen morning. "I wasn't going to tell you because you'd want me to rest it longer." "I would have. I know." She let the hide drop, turned around. She was standing on her own, weight distributed evenly, the careful, almost limp from the previous week mostly gone. The left arm was still in its sling. The bruising on her face had gone from purple to yellow-green to a shadow of itself, and the swelling was down. The structure of her face was visible now. The set of the jaw he'd seen in the photograph, the dark eyes, the particular quality of her attention that he'd come to think of as the way she was, rather than a posture she was holding. "I'm not good at being kept still," she said. "I noticed. I should probably warn you that I'm not going to be good at the other things you want me to be careful about either." He sat up, looked at her. "What other things?" She seemed to consider this, not evasively but genuinely, like she was deciding how direct to be and landing on fully direct. "You look at me and then you look at something else," she said. "You've been doing it since the second week. I don't know if you're doing it on purpose." The cabin was very quiet. The storm had passed 2 days ago, and the silence it left behind was the absolute post-blizzard silence of a world buried and muffled under 3 feet of new snow. Ridge could hear the fire. He could hear his own breathing. "Eliza," he said, and then stopped because he didn't know what came after that. "I'm not asking for anything," she said. Her voice was level, not cold. "I just don't want us to spend the whole winter pretending I haven't noticed, and you don't mean anything by it." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. Nobody looked away. "I don't know how to do this," he said finally. The words came out rougher than he'd intended, less composed, more honest. "I know how to keep someone alive. I know how to work beside someone. I don't know—" He pressed his palms against his knees. "I don't know the thing after that." Something moved in her expression. Not triumph. There was no version of her that would have looked triumphant about this. Something softer than that, and less safe. "Neither do I," she said. "Not really. Silas made sure of it." She paused. "We could just—" She stopped. "What?" "Not try to name it yet." She looked at the fire. "Just let it be what it is for a while." Ridge thought about that. It wasn't a thing he was naturally inclined toward. He was a man who liked to know what something was, to call it by its right name and deal with it accordingly. But he was also a man who had been alone for 10 years, and who had, in the last 2 weeks, discovered that the version of himself he'd built for solitude was not the only version he contained, maybe not even the most honest one. "All right," he said. She nodded, small and serious. Then she looked at him with something in the corner of her expression that was finally, unmistakably, a real smile, brief and warm and gone quickly, like a match struck in a dark room, enough to see by. "Now," she said, "are you going to teach me to split wood or not? My foot is fine." He stood up. "No." "Ridge, next week." He went to pull his coat from the peg. "Today you can teach me what's wrong with my cornbread." "Everything," she said immediately. "There are so many things wrong with your cornbread." He held the door open. Cold poured in from the lean-to. "Start with the worst one," he said. She walked past him, left arm in its sling, chin up, the almost smile still at the edge of her mouth. And he stood in the doorway for a second after she'd passed and looked at the room behind him. The cot with its rumpled blanket, the fire burning low, the 2 tin cups sitting on the table side by side the way they always ended up. And he held that image for a moment without knowing why. Then he followed her. That night the temperature dropped hard and fast, the way it sometimes did after a blizzard cleared. The cold coming down from the peaks with a seriousness that made everything contract. The logs of the cabin, the iron of the fireplace tools, the air itself, which took on the quality of something brittle and precise. They stayed close to the fire. She worked on the harness stitching, which was nearly done now, and he sharpened his knives, which didn't need sharpening, and they talked, real talking, not the careful exploratory talking of the first 2 weeks, but the kind that assumed a listener and didn't hedge everything it said. She told him about Chicago in summer, which she said was humid in a way that felt personal, like the city had a grudge against you. He told her about the first winter he'd spent alone on this mountain, which he'd been 24 and too stubborn to admit he didn't know what he was doing, and how he'd made almost every mistake a man could make short of the ones that killed you. She laughed at that, really laughed, the first time he'd heard it, and it was a sound that did something to the room, made it seem briefly larger than its actual dimensions. "You're laughing at a man who almost froze to death," he said. "I'm laughing at a 24-year-old who thought being stubborn was the same as being prepared," she said. "It's different." "Is it?" "Yes. I know, because I've made the same mistake." She looked at him across the fire. "Stubborn doesn't keep you warm. It just keeps you from admitting you're cold." He thought about that for a while. The knives sat in his lap, sharp enough, probably sharper than they needed to be. "What would you have done," he said, "if I hadn't come after you?" The question sat in the air between them. She didn't flinch from it. She considered it seriously, the way she considered most things. And then she said, "I'd have gotten as far under that tree as I could get, and I would have kept thinking about what I was going to do to Silas when I got out of it. You would have died under that tree." "Probably." She held his gaze, but not without a fight. He believed her, completely and without question. That was the thing about Eliza Vane that he'd been understanding by degrees since she first opened her eyes and looked at him across the freezing floor of the abandoned woods. She was not a woman who gave up. She'd been beaten and robbed and left to freeze, and her first clear thought upon waking in a stranger's cabin had been to ask how long she'd been out and what needed to be done. The stubbornness she'd identified in him was the same thing running in her, just trained differently, aimed at different targets. He put the knives away. "Your brother is going to come looking when the pass is clear," he said. Not for the first time. But he needed to say it again, needed to lay it out clearly, now that things between them had shifted from careful strangers to whatever they were becoming. "If he thinks you're dead, maybe not. But if word gets out that there's a woman at Mercer's cabin, word will get out," she said, calm as water. "Silas will hear it, and he'll come." She set down the harness work and looked at him. "That's why I need you to understand something, Ridge. When he comes, I'm not going to hide behind you. I'm not asking you to." "Good." Something in her voice had gone quiet and sure in the way of a person who had made a decision long ago and was simply living in its aftermath. "Because I've spent years hiding from Silas, moving around him, giving him pieces of my life to keep the peace, and the last thing he gave me was bruised ribs and a broken collarbone and a hole in the snow." She paused. "I'm done hiding." Ridge looked at her. The firelight on her face, the set of the jaw, the dark eyes that did not ask for reassurance because they had moved past the place where reassurance was the point. "All right," he said. The same two words he'd said before, but with different weight. She nodded, picked up the harness stitching again. Her right hand moved through the leather steady and sure, pulling each stitch tight, making something that had been torn into something that would hold. Outside, the cold pressed against the cabin walls and the mountain kept its silence deep and complete, and the fire burned exactly as hot as it needed to, and nothing that night was smooth or easy or without the specific gravity of people who had been damaged by the world and were deciding, together and separately, what to do about that. Neither of them said anything more about Silas that night, but the name sat in the room with them, the way it always did, waiting, patient, winter quiet, like something buried under all that snow that would still be there when the thaw came. The sling came off on the 21st day. Eliza did it herself, in the morning, before Ridge was fully awake. He heard the sound of her working at the knot. She'd never been able to manage it one-handed before, which meant her left hand was working well enough now to help, which meant the collarbone had knit far enough to bear it. He lay still and listened and didn't say anything until she made a small, sharp sound that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite relief, but lived somewhere between the two. "How does it feel?" he asked from across the room. "Strange." She was moving the arm in a slow, cautious arc, testing the range. "Like it belongs to someone else, and I'm borrowing it back." A pause. "It's stiff." "It'll be stiff for a while. Don't try to lift anything heavy with it yet." "I know. I mean it." "Ridge." She looked at him with that particular expression she had, patient, slightly exasperated, the look of a woman who had been receiving cautions from him for 3 weeks and had developed a specific tolerance for it. "I know." He got up, built the fire, made the coffee. She had been teaching him, by degrees, to make coffee that tasted like coffee rather than hot brown water. And he was about 60% of the way there, which she had told him was actually substantial progress. The morning established itself around them the way mornings did now. The small sounds of two people occupying the same space, the particular quiet of a cabin deep in winter where the snow outside created its own muffled silence, and the sounds inside, the fire, the coffee, boots on the floorboards, became the whole of the world. She rolled her left shoulder carefully, winced, kept going. He watched her and didn't tell her to stop. That was something he'd learned about her in 3 weeks. She needed to find her own edges. Telling her where they were didn't help. Watching her find them herself, and being there when she did, was the only version of care she could actually receive. That knowledge had come at a cost. On the 19th day, she'd tried to carry a full bucket of water from the snowmelt barrel, and her left side had seized on her mid-step, and she'd gone down hard on one knee, and he'd crossed the room so fast he'd knocked the stool over, and she'd looked up at him from the floor with her face white and her jaw set and said, "I'm fine," in a voice that dared him to say otherwise. He hadn't. He'd just picked up the bucket and finished carrying it and set it where it needed to go. She'd gotten up on her own, and they hadn't mentioned it again. What he'd understood in that moment, watching her get up off the floor with her teeth set against the pane, was something he didn't have an easy word for. It was admiration, partly, but it was also something that sat closer to his chest than admiration usually did. He poured the coffee, set hers on the table without comment. She sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around the cup. Both hands, for the first time in 3 weeks. And the way she did it, the slight pause before she used the left one, told him exactly how much the return of that simple capacity meant to her. "The passes will start to ease in February," he said. It was January now, deep January, the coldest part of the mountain winter. Maybe earlier if the snow pattern shifts. How long do we have? He thought about it. 4 to 6 weeks before any serious travel is possible. Maybe longer. She nodded. She'd been thinking about Silas. He could tell, not from anything she said, but from the quality of her silence. The way her eyes went distant sometimes and came back focused and resolved, like she was running a problem through her head and arriving at the same answer each time. "Tell me about the men he was running with," Ridge said. He'd been wanting to ask this more directly for a while. "In Chicago, the ones the debt was to." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Why?" "Because when he shows up here in the spring, he's not going to come alone, and I want to know what kind of men he brings." She was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she set the cup down and folded her hands on the table and talked in the clear, organized way she had when she was relaying information she'd sorted through before. 3 names. A man called Draper who ran a gambling operation out of a hotel on the south side of Chicago. 2 others whose last names she only partly knew. Silas had owed Draper money for over 2 years, a debt that had accumulated through a combination of bad luck, worse judgment, and Silas's fundamental inability to leave a table when he was losing. The debt had grown past what anyone could reasonably pay back, which meant Silas hadn't been trying to pay it back. He'd been running from it. "The gold from the estate," Ridge said. "Was it enough to clear what he owed Draper?" "Probably not entirely, but enough to run with. Enough to buy passage somewhere and start over." Her voice was even. "That's what Silas does. He starts over. He leaves the damage behind and goes somewhere new and starts the same story from the beginning." Not this time. She looked at him. Something moved through her expression. Gratitude, maybe, but with a heart edge underneath it, the edge of someone who had learned not to rely on gratitude alone. "No," she agreed. "Not this time." It was that afternoon, with the light coming gray and flat through the window hide, and both of them at the table with the work of the day spread between them, that she asked him the question nobody had asked him in years. "What did you do before this?" she said. "Before the mountain." He looked up from the trap mechanism he was repairing. She was watching him with the curious, direct attention that still occasionally caught him off guard, the quality of her focus that treated him like someone whose answer mattered. "Cattle work," he said. "When I was young. Then a stretch of Army scouting up near the Northern Territories. Then this." "How old were you when you came up here?" 24. "And the 10 years between that and now." "You never came down? Not once?" "Twice a year. Billings, for supplies. Sometimes Hatcher Station for mail." He paused. "I'm not a hermit. I just don't have a lot of use for town." "What happened in town?" He looked at her. "Usually a fight." She absorbed this without visible alarm. That was another thing about her. She didn't perform shock at the things that would make most women he'd encountered in his limited experience perform shock. She received information and sorted it and asked the next question. Were you always looking for one? No. He set the trap mechanism down, thought about how honest to be, and landed where he always landed with her, which was fully honest because anything less felt like a waste of both their time. But I'm large and I look like what I look like, and there are men who take that as a challenge. And when I was younger, I was... He stopped. Less controlled. What does that mean? It means when something went wrong, I went at it hard, and I didn't always stop when I should have. He said it flat and factual. I hurt people I shouldn't have hurt. Not killed, beyond Aldous Webb, who deserved it, but hurt. I had a temper that I didn't know how to... He turned his hand over on the table. I didn't know where to put it. She was listening without expression, the way she listened to the things that required her full attention. That's why the mountain, he said. Up here, the only thing I'm likely to hurt when the temper gets loose is a tree. She was quiet for a moment, then, do you still have it? The temper. Yes. But you haven't... She paused. In 3 weeks you've been angry plenty. You don't let it out sideways. I'm older. That's not what changed it, she said. It wasn't a challenge. She just said it the way she said things she was certain of. He looked at her. What do you think changed it? You decided to. She held his gaze. There are plenty of old men with bad tempers. Age doesn't fix it. The decision does. A pause. You decided who you wanted to be and you went up a mountain to practice being it. That's not running away. That's just... She thought for a second. That's just knowing yourself well enough to know what you need. Ridge sat with that for a moment. He told himself the mountain was about solitude, about the practical reality of being better suited to wilderness than to civilization. He'd never framed it the way she just had. He wasn't sure it was wrong either. You're not what I expected, he said. She raised an eyebrow. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone... He stopped. Tried again. The letters were good. I knew from the letters you were sharp. I didn't know you were... He gestured vaguely, which was not a thing he did often, the gesture of a man who had run out of precise language and was admitting it. Difficult? She offered. I was going to say honest. The corner of her mouth moved. Those aren't always different. He picked the trap mechanism back up. Went back to work. But something had shifted in the room, some small degree of remaining distance between them closing over, not with drama, but with the quiet inevitability of a thing that was simply going to happen regardless of anyone's reservations about it. The teaching had started properly in the 3rd week, once her foot was reliable and her arm was mostly functional. He took her out in the afternoons when the weather allowed, which was not often, but was sometimes, and showed her things. Not because she'd asked, though she had asked, but because teaching her felt necessary in a way he couldn't entirely articulate. She needed to know how to survive here, not for his sake, for her own. The idea of her leaving in the spring and not knowing these things was something he didn't examine too closely. He showed her how to read the snow, the difference between old pack and new fall, the places where the drifts hid holes deep enough to swallow a leg, the signs of animal movement that told you what had passed through and how recently. She was attentive in the field the way she was attentive at the table, asking questions that cut to the practical center of things rather than circling around them. The rabbit tracks go this way, but the snare is back that way, she said one afternoon, crouching in the snow beside a line of small prints. Why does it work if they're moving away from it? They loop, he said, crouching beside her. Follow the track long enough and it doubles back. They have patterns. They don't move randomly. Once you know the pattern, you put the snare on the return. She studied the tracks for a moment. So you're not catching them where they are. You're catching them where you know they're going to be. Yes. She looked up at him. He was close. They were both crouched over the same small set of tracks, and the proximity was just the proximity of two people looking at the same thing, but he was aware of it. He was always aware of it now, the specific awareness of exactly how much space was between them, which had become a kind of constant background calculation that he hadn't asked for and couldn't switch off. That's not just trapping, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. She stood up, brushed snow off her knee. All right, she said. Show me where to put the snare. The afternoon she split, her first piece of firewood was the 23rd day. He hadn't planned to let her try yet. Another week, he'd been thinking, give the collarbone more time. But she'd picked up the axe while he was checking on the mule, and by the time he came back around the side of the cabin, she was already standing with it, weighing it in both hands, assessing the round of pine on the block. He stopped. "Don't say don't," she said, not looking at him. "I wasn't going to." Which was not entirely true, but he'd stopped himself in time. She reset her feet the way she'd watched him do it, wider than she'd had them, weight forward slightly, and brought the axe up and swung it down. The blade hit the wood about 2 inches off center, which for a first attempt on an unfamiliar tool was not bad, and the round split, unevenly, into 2 pieces that fell to either side of the block. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "Your stance was right," he said. "Aim was a little off." "I know. I saw it." She picked up another round and set it on the block. "Show me the aim." He came and stood behind her, and he put his hands over hers on the axe handle, which was just practical. You couldn't describe the line of a swing. You could only feel it. She went still when he did it. He went still too, for a different and related reason. Then he made himself focus and moved her hands a fraction, adjusting the angle. "Straight down the center grain," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended. "You're looking at where you want the blade to land before you lift it. Keep your eye there the whole time." She nodded. He stepped back. She lifted the axe and brought it down, and the second round split clean, 2 even halves. She stood back and looked at it for a moment, and he stood behind her and looked at it too, and neither of them said anything for a few seconds. "Again," she said. He handed her another round. She split 8 pieces that afternoon. The last 3 were clean. Her left arm was shaking by the end, and she didn't admit it, but he could see it, the slight tremor in her shoulder when she set the axe down, and he picked up the split pieces without comment and stacked them himself. That evening she said, abruptly, over supper, "My mother left when I was 9. He looked up. She was looking at her plate. "She and my father didn't. It wasn't a good marriage. She went to her sister's in Ohio, and she didn't come back." She pushed her food around for a moment. "After that it was just me and my father and Silas. My father he wasn't cruel. He just wasn't very present. He worked. He provided. He didn't." She paused. There wasn't a lot of warmth in it. Ridge listened without speaking. "I think that's why I let it go on as long as I did with Silas," she said, "after father died. Because it was the only family I had left, and I knew it was wrong, but I kept thinking." She stopped. "I kept thinking that if I was patient enough, if I gave him enough, he would eventually—" She shook her head. "He wasn't going to. He was never going to." "No," Ridge said quietly. "He wasn't." She looked up at him. Her eyes were dry. She was not a woman who cried easily. He'd learned this. And the absence of tears made what was in her face more visible, not less. "I don't feel sorry for him anymore," she said. "I did for years. I felt sorry for him the whole time I was afraid of him. But I don't anymore." "Good," he said. Is that a bad thing? That I don't?" He looked at her steadily. "No, it's not a bad thing." She held his gaze. Then she nodded and went back to eating, and the fire behind her threw its orange light across the table and across her face, and across the walls of the small cabin that had, by degrees and without announcement, stopped being just his. Later that night, after the fire had banked down and the darkness settled and he was lying on his pallet listening to the deep silence of the mountain winter, he heard her voice from the cot. "Ridge." "Yeah, the letters I sent you." A pause. "Did you keep them?" He stared up at the dark ceiling. "Yes." Another pause, longer this time, then, "I kept yours too." He closed his eyes. "They're gone now," she said, "with everything else." He could hear the particular flatness in her voice that meant she was managing something she wasn't going to make a production of. "Silas burned the bag. I saw him do it. I couldn't—" She stopped. "I just didn't want you to think I didn't value them." "I know you did," he said. "How do you know?" "Because of how you write back," he said. "You write the way you listen, like what the other person said mattered to you before you put your own words down." The silence that followed was a long one. Not empty, the opposite of empty. "I remember them anyway," she said finally. "Most of what you wrote. I have a good memory." "Tell me one," he said, before he decided to say it. A pause. Then, in the dark, in the quiet of the buried mountain, she said, "I am not a man built for easy company, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But I'm a man who means what he says and does not leave things half-finished. If you come, I will do right by you, that I can promise." He'd written those words in August, sitting at this same table, in handwriting that was better than you'd expect from a man with his hands, but worse than he wanted it to be. He hadn't known, writing them, that he'd hear them back in a woman's voice in the darkest part of a January night, and that they would sound, coming back to him, like something he hadn't fully understood when he wrote them. You remembered it exactly, he said. I told you, she said. Good memory. He lay still in the dark and listened to the mountain breathe and thought about promises, what they cost, what they were worth, and what it meant to make one to a person who had spent most of their life learning not to trust them. He thought he was beginning to understand. February came in hard and then, in its second week, broke open. The temperature lifted 10 degrees in 3 days. Not warm, not by any reasonable standard, but warm enough that the snow on the southern face of the ridge began to settle and compact, and the sound of the mountain changed from the dead silent compression of deep winter to something looser, the occasional distant crack of ice shifting in the upper creek beds, the soft percussion of snow falling in clumps from the pine branches. Ridge knew this sound. He'd been listening for it. The passes weren't open, not yet, not for another 3 or 4 weeks of consistent thaw, but they were beginning to think about it. He didn't say anything to Eliza directly. He didn't need to. She was watching the weather the same way he was, with the same calculation behind her eyes, and one morning she came in from the lean-to where she'd been feeding the mule and said, "The creek's moving again." And he said, "I know." And that was the whole conversation. They both understood what it meant. What it meant was that the window between now and Silas was narrowing. They'd had nearly 3 months together on the mountain, the two of them and the blizzards and the relentless work of winter survival. And somewhere in those 3 months, the thing that had been building between them had stopped being something either of them was cautious about and started being simply a fact. The kind of fact you stopped examining because the examination cost more than it was worth, and the fact was just there regardless, solid and present and not going anywhere. He had not kissed her. That line had not been crossed, not because it wasn't present, but because they'd both arrived at an unspoken agreement that some things needed to wait until they were on the other side of whatever was coming. But he'd stopped looking away when she looked at him, and she'd stopped keeping careful distance when they worked side by side. And the evenings by the fire had become something he found himself moving through the rest of the day toward in the way he used to move through the day toward nothing in particular. It was on a Tuesday. He only knew because he'd kept a rough count in a notebook for supply purposes, that he came back from checking the north trap line and found her standing at the table with a small packet of folded papers in her hand. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. Her expression was composed, but her jaw was set in the specific way it got when she was prepared for an argument she didn't want to have. "I need to show you something," she said. He came in, closed the door, pulled off his gloves and coat, and came to the table. She set the papers down and spread them flat with both hands. They were documents, folded small and thin, slightly water-damaged at the edges but legible, the ink faded but readable. He looked at them without touching them. "What is this?" "The account records for my father's estate." She smoothed one corner flat. "I sewed them into the lining of my coat before I left Chicago. Silas knew about the money, but he didn't know I had these." She paused. "He thought he was leaving me without anything. He didn't know I had this." Ridge looked at the documents. They were what she said they were. A ledger of estate accounts, transfer records, property documentation, bearing a notary stamp from a Chicago firm. His name wasn't on any of it. Her name was. The numbers were substantial. "This proves the money was yours," he said. "It proves the money was mine and that Silas had no legal claim to any of it." She pulled one page forward. "This is a statement from the estate attorney confirming that Silas Vane received his portion of the inheritance in full settlement in September, 2 months before I left. He took his share, and then he came after mine anyway." Ridge looked at the page. Then he looked at her. "How long have you had these?" "The whole time." "You didn't tell me." "No." She held his gaze without flinching. "I wasn't sure how things would go. I needed to know." She paused. "I needed to know you first, before I trusted you with this." I understood that. It didn't mean it didn't land with a small sting. 3 months she'd been holding this back. But he understood it. She'd arrived on this mountain beaten and robbed by a man she was supposed to be able to trust. The idea that she'd needed 3 months to verify that he wasn't another version of that was not something he could argue with. "And now," he said, "now I trust you." Flat and simple and direct, the way she said the things she meant completely. And I think you need to know about these before Silas gets here, because this changes how we handle it. He pulled out a chair and sat down, looked at the documents laid out on the table. Tell me what you're thinking. She sat across from him and talked for 20 minutes, and he listened the way he always listened to her, fully, without interrupting, letting her work through the whole shape of it before he responded. What she laid out was not a plan built on anger. It was a plan built on information, and it was smarter than anything he would have come up with on his own, which he noted without feeling diminished by it. She'd had 3 months to think about this. She'd been thinking about it since before she left Chicago. She knew Silas in ways Ridge never could. Knew his vanity, his specific cowardice, the gap between his performance of authority and the hollow, frightened thing underneath it. He'll come with men, she said. He'll come with the story already constructed, that you took me against my will, that I'm being held here, that he's the concerned brother coming to retrieve his sister. It's the kind of story that sounds righteous and gives the men with him a reason to be violent on his behalf. Let him tell it, Ridge said. Exactly. She leaned forward. Let him tell it in front of everyone he brings, and then I step out and I tell the real story and I show them these. She tapped the documents. These men he'll bring, miners, drifters, whoever he's been running with since Chicago, they're not loyal to Silas. They're loyal to whoever seems to have the authority. The moment his authority breaks, they're just men standing in a yard looking for a reason to go home. And if it doesn't break? She looked at him evenly. Then you do what you do. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up one of the documents, looked at the notary stamp, set it back down. Where will you keep these until then? Same place I've had them. She refolded them with careful hands and tucked them back inside her coat, against the lining. On me. He looked at her. At the coat. At the 3 months of her standing in this cabin and working beside him and eating at his table and sleeping 10 feet from him, carrying this the whole time like a card held back. Not from dishonesty, but from the earned caution of a woman who'd learned that trust was not a thing you gave without verifying first. Eliza, he said. Don't apologize for anything, she said quickly. I'm not telling you this so you can feel guilty about it. I'm telling you so we can be ready. I wasn't going to apologize, he said. I was going to say I'm glad you kept them. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Something that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it. The expression of a person whose expectation had been quietly exceeded. Oh, she said. Then, good. He almost smiled. He covered it by standing up and going to check on the fire. The first rider came 2 weeks later. Ridge saw him from the upper tree line before the man saw the cabin. A single horse moving down the south trail at a cautious pace, the rider sitting too stiff for someone at ease, the horse stepping carefully over the softening snow. He watched from the tree line for a full minute before he decided it was a single man, no one behind him, and came down. He intercepted him in the yard. The man was 40 or so, weathered, with a miner's build, broad shoulders, thick hands, the look of someone who spent his life in physical work, but had not been above ground recently enough to have any color. He pulled up his horse when he saw Ridge come out of the tree line, and his eyes did the thing eyes always did with Ridge, the quick up and down assessment, the recalibration of expectations. Looking for Hatcher Station, the man said. Took a wrong trail. You're 3 miles north of Hatcher, Ridge said. Back up the south trail, stay left at the fork. The man nodded. He was looking at the cabin, at the smoke from the chimney, at the second set of boot prints in the snow near the door, which were clearly smaller than Ridge's. His eyes came back to Ridge's face with a particular quality that Ridge recognized as a man filing information away for later. Much obliged, the man said, and turned his horse and went back the way he came. Ridge stood in the yard and watched him go until he was out of sight. Then he stood for another minute, looking at the trail. He went inside. Eliza was at the table working on the second set of harness repairs she'd taken on. She'd finished the first in February and asked him for more, because her hands needed to be busy when her head was running. She looked up when he came in, saw his face. What? We had a visitor, he said. Lost, he said. She set the leather down. Silas's? I don't know. No, probably. He pulled off his coat, hung it. He saw the cabin, saw 2 sets of tracks. So he knows I'm here. He knows someone's here. Ridge looked at her. We have maybe a week, maybe less. She was quiet for a moment, her hands flat on the table, her expression doing the thing it did when she was moving through a sequence of thoughts quickly and arriving at a decision. Then she nodded, picked the harness back up. "Then we have a week to be ready," she said. He looked at her, the set of her shoulders, the steadiness of her hands on the leather, the complete absence of panic, and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that whatever this woman had been through to produce this quality in her, he was both grateful for and furious about, in equal measure and simultaneously. "I need to go into Hatcher tomorrow," he said. "There's a man there who owes me a debt. I want him to owe it to me somewhere he can be a witness." "What kind of witness?" "The kind that can confirm who you are and how you got here, if it comes to needing confirmation." He sat down. "A trading post man named Cutter. He's been in this valley for 20 years. People listen to him." Eliza nodded slowly. "You trust him?" "I trust that he values his business more than he values any favor to Silas, and Silas doesn't have anything to offer him." He paused. "It's not friendship, it's math." "That's honest," she said. "It's the best I've got." She considered it. "Take me with you." He looked at her. "I need people to see me," she said, "before Silas comes with his story. If I'm a ghost that nobody's seen, his version of events is the only one that exists. If people in Hatcher have met me, spoken to me, know I'm here willingly." She met his eyes. "It changes the math, like you said." He thought about the trail, the distance, the state of the snow. He thought about the rider who'd been in his yard 40 minutes ago, and how far the information he'd carried would travel before morning. He thought about Eliza standing in the yard of Hatcher Station like a woman who belonged to herself, which was the most dangerous thing she could be to Silas's story. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow, the ride down to Hatcher." Next morning was the first time they'd been off the mountain together, and the landscape was changed by the thaw. Not green, nothing was green yet, but the particular heavy white of deep winter had given way to a grayer, more broken terrain, the snow patchy on the southern slopes, the creek running openly in the lower elevation. She rode the mule. He walked beside it on the steep sections and rode his own horse on the flats. And they didn't talk much because the trail demanded attention, but when they came down into the valley and the station came into view, 3 buildings, smoke, the distant sound of horses, she straightened in the saddle in a way that reminded him sharply of the photograph. Chin level, eyes forward. Cutter was behind the trading counter when they came in. He was a small, dry, precise man with wire spectacles, and the permanent expression of someone who had been overcharged for something years ago and hadn't quite gotten over it. He looked at Ridge, looked at Eliza, looked back at Ridge. "Heard you had company," he said. "This is Eliza Vane," Ridge said. "She came from Chicago on the November stage. She was robbed and assaulted at the relay station, and I brought her up to my place to recover. She's been there since." Cutter looked at Eliza with the assessing eyes of a man who ran a business at the crossroads of every kind of human traffic the frontier produced. "You all right, miss?" "I am now," Eliza said. Not warmly, but clearly. The voice of a woman who was telling the exact truth and wanted it noted. "I understand you're someone people in this valley trust." Cutter blinked, looked at Ridge. "She always talk like that?" "Yes," Ridge said. "The man who attacked me is my half-brother," Eliza said. "His name is Silas Vane. He will likely come to this valley in the next week or two with men and with a story that does not resemble the truth. I want you to have heard the truth first, from me, so that you know the difference when you hear it." Cutter took his spectacles off, cleaned them on his shirt, put them back on. "What kind of trouble are we talking?" "The armed kind," Ridge said. "Wonderful," Cutter said flatly. Eliza laid the estate documents on the counter. Not all of them. She was careful about that. But the top sheet, the one with the notary stamp and the estate attorney's signature, and her name in clear ink. "This is mine," she said. "And what he took from me was mine. I want that on record somewhere before he arrives." Cutter looked at the document for a long time. He was not a stupid man. That was why Ridge had come to him. He understood what was being asked of him, and he understood that saying yes had a cost and saying no had a different cost, and he was calculating which cost he could better afford. "I remember the November stage," he said finally. "I remember hearing it came through short a passenger. Somebody said the woman never got off at Hatcher." He looked at Eliza. "I can say what I know and what you've told me. I can say it to whoever asks." He paused. "I'm not putting a gun in anybody's yard." "I'm not asking you to," Eliza said. I'm asking you to remember this conversation. Cutter looked at the document one more time, looked at Eliza, looked at Ridge with an expression that said many things, the clearest of which was, "You have complicated my life considerably," and then he reached across the counter and slid the document back toward her. "I'll remember it," he said. They rode back up in the late afternoon, the light going gold and thin across the snow. Neither of them spoke for the first mile. Then Eliza, from the mule's back, said, "He's going to come with more men than we expect." "Probably. He's always compensated for his own fear by surrounding himself with people who aren't afraid." She was looking at the trail ahead. "When he sees you, he'll want to let the men do it. He won't want to face you himself." "I know. Don't let him stand behind them," she said. "When it happens, when he starts his story, make him come out from behind them. Make him stand where everyone can see his face when I start talking." Ridge rode for a moment without responding. The mountain above them was gray and still in the late light. "And if he doesn't come out?" She looked at him. Her face in the cold afternoon was serious and clear and not afraid, or rather, afraid in the way she'd described, fully and presently afraid, and moving through it anyway. "Then I'll go in and get him," she said. He believed her. The mule picked its way up the trail, and the horse followed, and the mountain held them both in its indifferent, enormous quiet. And somewhere in the valley below, something that had been set in motion 5 months ago in a Chicago train station was moving toward its conclusion, patient and inevitable as the spring thaw eating through the ice. That night Ridge sat by the fire long after Eliza had gone to sleep, and he checked the rifle and cleaned it, and checked it again, and then set it above the door where it lived and sat back down and looked at the fire. He was not afraid. He'd stopped being afraid of confrontations like the one that was coming when he was about 25 years old, around the same time he'd made the decision she'd identified, the decision about who he wanted to be. He was not afraid. He was something else, something that sat closer to the surface and was harder to name. He was afraid of something going wrong in the specific direction that took her from him. Not from the mountain, from the world. He sat with that for a while, let himself look at it straight. He had carried a woman 4 miles through a blizzard because she was bleeding in the snow, and he couldn't walk away from that. That was the reason he'd given himself, the reason that was true, and was also not the whole truth. And sitting here in the firelight with the rifle above the door and the spring thaw moving through the valley below, he was done pretending the rest of it wasn't true too. He looked at the cot where she was sleeping. He would not let anything happen to her, not because he'd carried her here, not because of the letters or the months of winter, or the way she'd rebuilt herself piece by piece on his floor while the blizzards tried to make everything impossible. Because she was Eliza, and she was here, and she had, without asking for it and without being given it in any formal or declared way, become the specific person he would burn down everything else to protect. He went to sleep before midnight. He needed to be rested. Silas was coming. They came on a Thursday morning, 9 days after the rider had stood in Ridge's yard with his 2 careful eyes and his lost traveler's story. Ridge heard them before he saw them. The sound of multiple horses on the south trail, the particular noise of a group moving without much effort at quiet, men who expected their numbers to do the announcing for them. He was already outside when they came through the tree line into the yard. He'd been outside for 20 minutes, ever since the mule had gone still in the lean-to with that particular ear-forward alertness that had become, over the winter, a reliable early warning system. He stood in the center of the yard and counted them as they came through. 6 horses, 6 men, Silas at the front. He'd built a picture of Silas over the winter from everything Eliza had told him, assembled it piece by piece from description and implication, and the things she didn't say but that lived in the spaces between the things she did. The man who rode into his yard matched that picture closely enough to be uncomfortable, not because he was physically imposing, which he wasn't, but because of the specific quality of his ease. He rode loose and unhurried, like a man arriving somewhere he already owned, his coat clean and his hat straight, and his face arranged in an expression of reasonable concern that Ridge recognized immediately as a performance being delivered to an audience. The audience was the 5 men behind him, and possibly anyone else who might be watching from somewhere Ridge couldn't see. Silas pulled up his horse at the edge of the yard, looked at Ridge, looked at the cabin door behind him, smiled. "You must be Mercer," he said. His voice was easy, conversational, carrying the faint trace of a Chicago accent smoothed over by months on the road. "I've heard about you." He said it in the tone of a man who had heard things and chosen not to be deterred by them, the tone of righteousness, performed carefully. I'm here for my sister. I've been looking for her since November. Ridge said nothing. Silas glanced at the men behind him. A brief, almost imperceptible check, confirming they were with him, and continued. I don't know what she's told you, or what she might have. Look, she's not well, Eliza. She hasn't been well for some time. I'm sure you meant no harm, but she's not in any condition to be making decisions about where she... The cabin door opened. Silas stopped talking. Eliza came out and stood on the step, and the morning light was flat and gray and cold, and she stood in it without any expression on her face, which was, Ridge had learned over 3 months, her most dangerous state. Not anger, not fear. Just the absolute still face of a woman who had made all her decisions already and was simply executing them. She looked at Silas. He hadn't expected her to be on her feet. Ridge could see it in the half-second recalibration that moved through Silas's face before the performance reassembled itself. He'd been expecting someone diminished, someone who would shrink when she saw him, someone whose condition would validate his story by its visible evidence. What he got was a woman standing straight and clear-eyed in a cabin doorway with no fear in her face that she was going to let him see. Eliza. His voice shifted, went warmer, more personal. Thank God. I've been... Don't, she said, one word, flat as a stone. The 5 men behind Silas exchanged glances. They were the type she'd predicted. Hard-used men, working men, some combination of miners and drifters, and whatever else Silas had been able to scrape together from the valley settlements. They'd come because Silas had given them a story that justified being here. Ridge could see them now, trying to match that story to what was in front of them. A woman who was clearly not being held against her will. A woman who had just told the man they came with to not speak to her. A woman whose expression held none of the distress the story had promised. You look well, Silas said carefully, adjusting. Considering you left me under a tree to die in November, she said. Eliza, he made his voice pained, aggrieved. That's not... I don't know what you remember from that day. You weren't... I remember all of it. She came down the step and walked into the yard and stopped 10 feet from his horse. Ridge tracked the distance between them and shifted slightly, keeping himself in Silas's sightline. I remember the relay station. I remember you taking the bag. I remember exactly what you said when I tried to stop you. She paused. Do you want me to say it in front of these men, or do you want to keep going with the story you've got? Silas looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face. A brief dissolution of the easy confidence. A glimpse of the thing underneath it, which was exactly what she'd described to Ridge on a winter night in front of a fire. A frightened man who had always won by making others afraid first. Encountering someone who had stopped being afraid of him and not knowing what to do about it. He recovered fast. Ridge gave him credit for that. Whatever else Silas was, he was practiced. You're confused, he said, his voice firming back up, projecting now for the men behind him. You were half dead when whoever found you did, and trauma does things to memory. That's just a medical fact. I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to bring you home. I am home, Eliza said. That landed differently than anything else she'd said. Ridge felt it. The particular weight of those 3 words in a yard on a Montana mountain in March. He felt it in his chest in a way he didn't have time to examine right now, but noted. Silas heard it too. His jaw tightened. The performed ease was costing him more now, visible in the set of his shoulders, the way his right hand had moved without his seeming to notice it toward the front of his coat. Mercer, he said, looking at Ridge directly for the first time. I don't know what she's told you, but this woman is not in her right mind. I'm her legal family, and I am asking you, man to man, to step aside and let me take her somewhere she can be properly looked after. Ridge looked at him. No. Just that. Silas blinked. These are my men, Silas said, his voice dropping, the performance thinning into something raw. There are 6 of us, and 1 of you, and I am asking you to be reasonable about this. 5, said a voice from the back. Everyone looked. One of the riders, a broad, weathered man in a canvas coat, the one who looked most like a miner and least like a man who needed anyone's story to feel righteous, had shifted his horse a step sideways, out of the group's formation. He was looking at Eliza, not at Silas. You said your brother robbed you, he said. That true? Yes, Eliza said. And left you in the snow? Yes. The miner looked at Silas, then back at Eliza, then at Ridge. He was doing a calculation, and the calculation was not complicated and was arriving at a clear answer. I signed on to help a man find his sister, he said, not to drag a woman out of her own house. Silas turned on him. Harlan, I'm done, Harlan said simply. He turned his horse. For a moment, nothing happened. That moment was the most dangerous moment. Ridge recognized it, had lived in moments like it before. The suspended second where things could tip either way, and the only thing that determined which way was who moved first and how. He kept himself still, kept his hands visible, watched Silas. He watched Eliza take the documents from inside her coat. These are the estate records from our father's will, she said, her voice carrying clear across the yard. She held them up, not offering them to anyone, just making them visible, a physical fact that everyone present could see existed. This one, she separated the top sheet, is a signed statement from the estate attorney confirming that Silas Vane received his full inheritance settlement in September of last year. He took his share legally and in full. Everything remaining was mine. She looked at the men still sitting behind Silas. Whatever he told you about why he needed his sister brought back, he needed the money he didn't get. That's the whole story. The second rider pulled up without being asked. Then the third. They weren't dramatic about it. No declarations, no confrontations with Silas. They simply reoriented their horses toward the trail and began moving, the way men do when the job they were hired for has turned into something else entirely, and they've decided their time is worth more than whatever they're being paid. Silas watched them go. His face had gone through several things in the last 30 seconds. Anger, calculation, the frantic internal scrambling of a man watching his leverage evaporate. And now it had settled on something uglier and more honest. He looked at Eliza with all the pretense dropped, and what was under the pretense was exactly what she'd told Ridge it would be. Small and mean and desperate in the specific way of someone who had never once in their life accepted a consequence they could wriggle out of. You think this is finished, he said. His voice was low now, not performing for anyone. You think showing some papers to a bunch of men who don't care about you makes this finished. Silas, she said. You were supposed to be nothing, he said, and his voice cracked on it, the crack of a man saying the true thing finally, the thing underneath all the other things. You were always nothing. Father's money was supposed to... Silas, her voice was steady. It's over. Take what's left of your dignity and leave this mountain. His hand went into his coat. Ridge was already moving when it happened. He had been tracking that hand for 60 seconds, had seen the decision arrive in Silas's body before Silas had consciously made it, and he was across 8 feet of frozen yard before the revolver was fully clear of the coat. But Eliza was closer. She shoved Ridge sideways, hard, with both hands, the left arm she'd been protecting all winter put into it without hesitation. And the shot that was meant for Ridge's chest went wide and hit the fence post behind him. The sound of it cracked across the yard and off the mountain face and came back as echo, and Ridge spun with the momentum of her shove and came up with the rifle that had been in his hand since he came outside this morning. One shot. The revolver dropped from Silas's hand and Silas dropped with it, not dead. Ridge was precise when he needed to be, had been precise since he was 19 years old and had stopped being careless about it. But down and staying down, his shoulder broken by a bullet that went exactly where Ridge intended it to go. The last rider in the yard turned his horse and was gone without a word. Silence. Ridge lowered the rifle. His heart was running hard, but his hands were steady. He looked at Eliza first. She was standing 3 feet from where she'd shoved him, left arm wrapped against her body now that the moment was over, her face white, but her eyes clear. Your arm, he said. I know. Her voice was tight. I know. Silas was making sounds in the snow. Not screaming, something lower and more sustained than screaming. The sounds of a man in serious pain who hadn't yet fully understood the scope of what had just happened to him. Ridge walked over and stood above him and looked down at him without moving to help him, and without moving to do anything else either. Silas looked up. His face was very different than it had been 20 minutes ago. All of the ease gone. All of the performance stripped away. What was left was young and afraid in a way that Ridge recognized as the thing that had always been there. The original damage underneath all the other damage. A man who had never learned how to be without taking from someone else, because nobody had ever made the cost high enough to teach him. Can you ride? Ridge said. Silas stared at him. You shot me. I know. Can you ride? A long pause. Yes. Then you're going to get on your horse, Ridge said, and you're going to ride to Hatcher Station, and from Hatcher, you're going to keep going, not back to Chicago, not anywhere Eliza is ever going to be. You're going to find somewhere else, and you're going to start being a different kind of man, or you're going to keep being the same kind of man and run out of road faster than you expect. He crouched down to Silas's level. His voice was even and quiet and completely without heat. If I ever see you on this mountain again, I won't aim for the shoulder. Silas said nothing. He looked past Ridge to where Eliza was standing. She was looking at her brother with an expression that Ridge couldn't fully interpret. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not even the relief he might have expected. Something more complicated and more sad. The expression of a person looking at the end of something that was never going to be what it was supposed to be. I'm sorry you are what you are, she said. I'm not sorry this is over. She walked inside and closed the door. Ridge got Silas onto his horse. It wasn't gentle, and he didn't try to make it gentle, but he did it. Because leaving a man to bleed out in a yard was not who he was, regardless of what the man had done. He tied the shoulder rough and tight enough to hold until Hatcher and told Silas to keep the arm down and pointed him south. He watched Silas ride until the tree line swallowed him. Then he stood in the yard alone for a moment and breathed the cold March air and looked at the mountain above him. The peaks still white, the lower slopes gray with the thaw. The sky a pale, hard blue that was different from winter's sky in ways you couldn't quite describe to anyone who hadn't lived through the difference. Alive, maybe. That was the word for it. The sky looked alive again. He went inside. Eliza was sitting at the table. She'd unwrapped the left arm and was examining it with the careful, clinical expression she used for assessing damage. The same expression she'd turned on her own frostbitten feet back in November. The look of someone who had long practiced at taking stock of what the world had done to them and deciding what to do about it. Let me look, he said. It's not broken again. She said it before he could suggest it. It's sore. I pulled something. It'll be fine in a few days. Let me look, he said again, more quietly. She let him look. He ran his fingers carefully along the collarbone that had healed over the winter, pressed gently at the joint, checked the movement. She was right. Not broken, but she'd torn something in the muscle, probably the same tissue that had been healing for months, and it would hurt for a while. You didn't have to do that, he said. He was still holding her arm, more gently now than the examination required. Yes, I did. Eliza, he was going to hit your heart. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but her jaw was doing the thing, the set, the hold. I had the angle. You didn't. She looked at him directly. Don't make it complicated. It was just math. He looked at her for a long moment, her hand in his hands, the arm she'd used to push him out of the path of a bullet that would have killed him, the face that was composed and direct and still a little white around the edges, because math or no math, she was human, and what had just happened in the yard was not nothing. Eliza, he said, and the word came out different than it usually did, quieter, stripped of its practical function, just her name said the way you said the name of something you didn't want to lose. She looked at him. He leaned forward and kissed her. It was not graceful, and it was not smooth, and she made a surprise sound against his mouth, and then her right hand came up and held the front of his shirt, and it lasted about 4 seconds before he pulled back and looked at her, because he needed to see her face before he decided anything else. Her face was not composed anymore, which was the most he'd ever asked of anything. Took you long enough, she said. Her voice was rough, and the corner of her mouth was doing the thing, the almost smile that had become over months the thing he most wanted to produce in her. I was being careful, he said. You really weren't. No, he admitted. I really wasn't. She laughed. The same laugh as that evening weeks ago, warm and real, filling the room, bigger than the room's actual dimensions. He sat back in his chair and listened to it and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for longer than he could honestly account for. Spring came properly in April. It came the way spring came on that mountain, not gently, not all at once, but in aggressive lurches. A week of thaw, a late snowfall that seemed like betrayal until you remembered it was April, and the mountain didn't care about your timeline. Then another thaw harder than the first. And then one morning you walked outside and the sound was completely different. Water everywhere, the creek running loud and full, birds doing the complicated business of returning to places they'd left 6 months ago. The air carrying the specific sharp green smell of things that had been under snow all winter, finally seeing light again. Ridge spent April building. He'd been planning it since February, working the problem in the back of his head during the long winter evenings. The cabin was too small, had always been too small, had been the right size for one solitary man who didn't expect to have another person's life intersecting with his own. He knew what needed to happen. He expanded the east wall first, adding 10 feet that would eventually be a proper room. He rebuilt the lean-to into a real stable. He put in a second window. Eliza worked beside him, not as a helper, as a partner, doing the jobs she was capable of and learning the ones she wasn't yet, asking the right questions and making the right observations, and occasionally improving on his original plan in ways he acknowledged without ceremony. They had their arguments still. They would always have their arguments. That was simply the texture of the two of them together, two people who said what they thought and didn't easily back down from it. But the arguments had changed quality over months. They were the arguments of people who trusted each other enough to disagree, which was different from and better than the careful negotiations of people who weren't sure yet what the other could take. He came to understand that spring what she had meant in her first letter when she wrote, "I am looking for a place to belong." He'd read it as a practical statement, a woman looking for relocation, for opportunity, for the new life that the frontier offered to people willing to do what it took. He understood now that it was also something else. She'd spent her whole life belonging to a situation rather than a place, to her father's house, to Silas's needs, to the shape that other people's wants had pressed her into. She'd been looking for somewhere that would let her be the shape she actually was. He'd been looking for the same thing, he realized, since he was 24, and had climbed this mountain to practice being a person he could tolerate being. They'd found it, both of them, in the same unlikely place. Cutter came up from Hatcher in May with the information Ridge had been waiting for. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, tied his horse at the new post Ridge had put in beside the rebuilt stable, and accepted coffee from Eliza with the expression of a man still recalibrating his expectations every time he came here. "Your brother made it to Hatcher," he said, addressing Eliza directly, because he'd learned by now that she was the person to address. Stayed 2 days, had the shoulder tended, kept quiet about what happened. Bought passage on the stage east. He paused. Heard from the driver that he was heading to Denver. "Did he say anything?" Eliza asked. "About coming back?" "No." Cutter turned his coffee cup in his hands. He said, he paused, seeming to decide whether it was worth relaying. He said his sister had made her choice, and he was done with the mountains. That was it. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Ridge watched her receive this information. Not with relief exactly. Not with the uncomplicated gladness that the end of a threat ought to produce. Something more honest than that. The complicated quiet of someone closing a door on a room they'd lived in too long, knowing the room had damaged them, also knowing they'd once loved the person who lived there with them, and that both of those things could be true at the same time without canceling each other out. "Thank you," she said to Cutter, and meant it. Cutter nodded, finished his coffee, looked around the expanded cabin, the new stable, the fence that now ran proper and square around the property. He looked at the two of them, at the specific quality of two people sharing a space that had clearly been built around both of them, and put his cup down. "I'll tell you something," he said, standing to leave. "People in the valley have been talking about this place since winter, about Mercer having a woman up here, about the business with her brother. You know how people talk?" He looked at Ridge. "Used to be the talk about this mountain was about you being somebody to steer clear of. That's not what it is now." "What is it now?" Ridge asked. Cutter looked at Eliza. "Now they say there's a woman up here that faced down 6 armed men with a piece of paper, and won." He shrugged, with the expression of a man who had seen considerable frontier history and was willing to grant that this was notable. People respect that kind of thing. He left. They stood in the yard and watched him go, and then stood for a moment in the May afternoon, the light warm and genuine now, the mountain holding the green of new growth on its lower slopes, the air carrying the smell of it. "A piece of paper and one," Eliza said. "You also pushed me out of the way of a bullet," Ridge said. "The paper was more elegant." "It was," he agreed. She looked at him. He looked at her. The mule made a sound in the stable behind them, the specific, mildly irritated sound that meant she wanted attention and was willing to be vocal about it. "Your mule," Eliza said. "Our mule," he said. She looked at him for a moment. He watched something move through her face, not the brief flash of the almost smile, but the real one, the full version, the one that changed the whole face the way he'd thought it would back in November when he'd made himself stop thinking about it. "Our mule," she agreed. They went back inside. The summer passed in work and weather and the small, ordinary accumulation of a life being built. Travelers came through the mountain pass, and some of them stopped, and some of those who stopped came back, and by August they had the rough shape of something that would become, over the following year, what the valley eventually knew as Mercer's trading post. Not planned exactly, more grown than built. An organic thing that happened because Eliza was constitutionally incapable of letting a stranded traveler keep being stranded when she had supplies, and Ridge was constitutionally incapable of saying no to her when she decided something should be done. He carved the chair on an evening in October, when the first snow was coming down soft outside the window. Not the hard-driving snow of the high winter storms. Not yet, just the early season snow, quiet and clean, coming down in the dark outside the glass he'd put in to replace the oiled hide. I wasn't sure what made him make it that evening. He'd been meaning to make a second chair for months. The cabin had enough of everything else now, the expanded room, the proper furniture, the kind of domestic reality that a year ago had been as abstract to him as the inside of someone else's life. But the single chair by the fire had somehow been the last thing to get done, and he'd finally gotten around to it. He set it beside the fire, next to the one that had been there for years. Eliza was sitting in the old one, reading. She'd gotten 3 books from a traveler passing through in September, and she was working through them with the particular focused pleasure of someone who had genuinely missed having books. She looked up when he placed the new chair and looked at it, and looked at him. "It took you a while," she said. "I kept being busy." "You were avoiding it." He sat down in it. It was a good chair, solid, well-joined, with the slight imperfection in one armrest that came from the wood having a knot he'd worked around rather than through. "Maybe," he said. She looked back at her book. The fire was going well, throwing its steady warm light across the floor, across the 2 cups on the table, across the walls of the cabin that was no longer just a box a man had built to disappear into. Ridge, she said, not looking up from the page. "Yeah." "I'm glad you came after me." He looked at her in the firelight, at the face he'd learned over a year, the set of the jaw, the dark eyes, the particular quality of her when she was at rest, which was different and more open than the composed face she wore when the world required her to hold herself together. He thought about the drag marks in the snow, the empty clearing, the woman under the pine tree who had been so close to gone that the distance could be measured in hours. I thought about how many times a man walks past the thing that was going to matter most to him without knowing it, and how rarely he gets the version of the story where he turns around. "I know," he said. She smiled, turned a page. Outside, the snow